Good afternoon and welcome to the Science Gallery Venice session. My name is Ariane Koek. I'm the curator of Earth, Water, Sky, the Environmental Arts and Science Residency at Science Gallery Venice. In 2020, our artist in residence, hopefully physically, but definitely digitally at the moment, is Haseeb Ahmed, who joins us from Brussels in his atelier. Hi Haseeb, how are you?
Doing well, yeah, glad to be here.
Well, what's going to happen in this session is Haseeb's going to present his film Wind Egg, which was made in 2018, which shows you a little insight into his obsession and fascination with the subject of wind, which is also the subject of his residency in Venice. And then afterwards, Haseeb's going to present his work, his artistic work, for 20 minutes. And then at 5 o'clock, we're going to have a mini discussion about his work and open it up to the public for questions. But for now, I'm going to get Haseeb to introduce Wind Egg and give you an insight as to what to expect, enjoy, and be surprised about in the next following 40 minutes. So Haseeb, tell us all.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be presenting this film. It's my first artistic film. There's some others in the works. The film was shot at the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics, which is a NATO aeronautics facility on the outskirts of Brussels, which was founded in 1911, so tracks closely with just the advent of flight itself. And I'd been working there for 3 years prior to this film, working on trying to realize the concept of the wind egg, which is an idea that dates back 3,000 years. And it has variations in Arabic, Greek, Chinese cultures. This idea that animals and people can be fertilized by the wind, the way that plants are. And I wanted to use the cutting edge wind tunnel technology at the Von Karman Institute to realize this possibility, to see if eventually if people could reproduce with the wind, using technology and without men, to see if that how that might change fundamental aspects of society itself.
And what will people need to look out for in the next 40 minutes? Are there some surprises in there?
Yeah, we uncovered many interesting things within the wind tunnels. I think that you'll meet the face of the wind itself as a turbulence pattern. There's eggs that start to beat as the wind penetrates them themselves. Yeah, I think that there's many nuances and kind of mysteries bound up within the wind there.
Brilliant. Well, look forward to speaking to you after the film in 40 minutes time. Thanks a lot, Haseeb.
Thank you, Ariana. Looking forward.
For 3 years now, researchers have been working on the wind egg experiment at the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics, or VKI, a NATO aeronautics facility on the outskirts of Brussels. The institute was established in 1921 as the Service de l'Aéronautique Belgique and was refounded as the VKI after the Second World War to integrate the advances made by both the Axis and the Allies. The modern wind tunnel technology at the VKI is being used to fertilize a wind egg. 4 facilities located deep within the institute are dedicated to this. Now that humanity needs it most, the wind egg experiment asks, what if animals and people could be fertilized by the wind just as plants are? Could humans reproduce with the wind and without men? This project has been going on for over 3,000 years when you consider its ancient Greek, Arabic, and Chinese roots. Sitting high atop the institute, the first wind egg lab is the Vki Vulture Aviary. It is in a converted air return of a vertical wind tunnel. From the ancient Greeks onward, it was believed that certain animals reproduced solely with the wind and were exclusively female. Most known among them were vultures and their partner, Aeolus, the western wind. They meet each spring. Here in the aviary, the mating calls of vultures are collected. They are key and the starting point of the fertilization of wind eggs. The second stage of the process takes place in the L2B wind egg insemination lab. Researchers prepare the calls of the vulture for introduction into our aeroacoustic wind tunnel. Downstream lies a wind egg. A microphone embedded within it records the amount of wind penetrating its outer surface. This is the unaltered sound recorded within the wind egg. A wind egg has been successfully inseminated. The wind egg incubation chamber is housed in the turbine section of the L1, the VKI's largest wind tunnel. Aerofecundity is maintained with a special fertilizer unit. heartbeat emanates from each egg. Each is different, as not all were healthy. Sound is air moving. Here, a specially designed acoustic vortex creates the precise incubation conditions needed for wind eggs. The sound used is derived from the calls of the mother vulture. One researcher inhabits the halls en route to the final laboratory of the wind egg experiment. He is fixated on an ancient Babylonian sphinx lamassu. They had the heads of man, the wings of eagles, and 5 legs to convey stability from every angle, as they amplify the wind if they are installed at the gates. When the EU Parliament was built, an accidental urban wind canyon created unforeseen problems of wind nuisance. Politicians were being blown over before they could enter the EU Parliament building. This researcher is looking through time for alternative solutions. He continues his research despite his proposal being put down years ago. It was deemed too undemocratic in nature, and a comfort ring has been built instead. For nearly 100 years, everything made in this place remains locked away within its walls for reasons of intellectual property and industrial espionage. These are the original test models of the Apollo space missions. In the final lab of the wind egg experiment, the wind itself resides. It was determined that it was male as a consequence of its fertilizing wind eggs. The researchers use a flow visualization technique with a model of a delta wing to conjure up its face. They work to establish communication with it, and have developed a computer program to repeatedly expose it to 4 different types of language and measure its responses to establish correlations. They are futurist poetry, Latin, emoticons, and improvised live typing. Work continues, propelled by necessity and the wind, facilitated by machines and the knowledge carried in them. If successful, the wind egg research done here at the VKI could reshape human reproduction. Conception could occur without men, but with the wind alone. Human conception could occur with the wind and without men, like plants, freeing men from their nature and freeing women from men with technology.
And that was The Wind Egg by Science Gallery Venice's Artists in Residence this year, 2020, on the Earth Water Sky Residency, Haseeb Ahmed. And it's a film he made in 2018, before the residency, I ought to add. We're now just going to hear from Haseeb for about 20 minutes about his artistic practice. And after that, there's going to be a question and answer session at roughly 5 o'clock. So over to you, Haseeb, now, and we're looking forward to learning more about your practice in depth.
Thank you very much, Ariana, and thanks everybody for joining for the screening. It's a real honor to be presenting this work with you all here. Yeah, I'd just like to take an opportunity to kind of speak a bit more in depth about the different aspects that are involved in this research project. This was the first part of a trilogy, the Wind Egg trilogy, which took place as a site-specific installation and performance, which was then captured as a film, which for me was meant to be more than just documentation, and take a life of its own, as you can see. And I'd like to share with you kind of what happened after that point. So I continued to work on this project for 3 years afterwards, and I will have a presentation prepared now. Yes. Sorry, one moment. What? Okay, there we go. Yes, so I'd just like to go a little bit more in depth here. Starting with the kind of most general broad point, this is a NASA photograph of the atmosphere itself. And for me, what's been really interesting and important to realize is that all life exists within this relatively thin layer of air, of fluid, that's bound by gravity to the Earth's surface. And the kind of precarity of that as well, you know, that there's this sort of fragility that without this membrane, there would be no life itself. This is a visualization just to show the relative mass of the atmosphere itself there on the left compared to the mass of the Earth itself, just to give a little bit of perspective. And what's interesting for me then is how do we, in a way, we're kind of akin to fishes swimming in water, but we're sort of moving through the fluid of the air. But in a way, it's kind of invisible to us. The air is always touching us, but we can't quite touch it. We can't really see the movement of the air, but we can only see the way that it affects the things around us. And so there's this kind of indirectness that kind of constantly pulls me in and draws me into this topic, trying to give it form. And I feel like that's in itself already akin to what it means to be an artist as well, at least for me, is trying to give form to those things that don't quite have one yet, those things which are kind of latent within our kind of social lives. So in order to do that, I started working at the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics, which is a NATO aeronautics facility on the outskirts of Brussels and where the film itself was shot. For me, what was interesting is that this is, in a way, it's a type of observatory for the air, all of the phenomena that the air kind of contains. So it's full of wind tunnels that have been built up since 1911. Which are all meant to kind of inspect different kinds of regimes of the movement of the air. What's interesting also is that fluid, the way it's wind tunnels scale things down to a much smaller observable scale, but that scaling is nonlinear. So the way that an insect might fly through the air is very different than the way an airplane does. And that's because there's a fixed density to the air. So when you're trying to model those movements, there's a kind of another degree of abstraction that takes place. But in particular, what I was interested in was like, what are some of the narratives, the particular narratives and the particulates that are moved through the air. This is just like one example that I found very compelling when I first came to the Von Karman Institute. So this is a study of Place Leopold, just in front of the European Parliament. And it's a wind tunnel study using sand to visualize the movement of the air. And in the original construction, it was the architecture had actually created an urban wind canyon. So all of the politicians, as they were entering the parliament, were being kind of blown over before they could enter the parliament itself, because of this urban wind canyon that the building itself had created. So you see that here because the sand is pink and there's no sand there, there's gray. And so what had to be constructed was a comfort ring. This is like a study then for the architecture that would intervene in order to suppress the turbulences of the air, and allow people to move much more comfortably. In fact, it's called a comfort ring itself there. So, and in that moment, there's a ton of kind of metaphorical possibility bound up in the idea that that the European Union, that the politicians themselves were being affected by the turbulences that the building itself was creating, and that once they entered, also that they were safe from those turbulences around that the building had created. So this is a wind tunnel test of the model. This is the model in the wind tunnel itself. And what's interesting is that wind tunnels, they make the air move straight so that it becomes something that's controllable, whereas in nature, air is endlessly chaotic. In order to do studies, wind tunnel studies of architecture and of landscapes, they actually have to make the air turbulent again. So that's why you see all of these blocks and these cups in the back, which I also think is quite an interesting quirk. One of the aspects, I'd just like to now go into detail with a couple of the installations that you saw within the film. And this is a computer fluid dynamics visualization or simulation of what's called an acoustic vortex. So the air contains many things, transmits many things as a medium, including sound. So the only reason you can hear my voice right now is that the computer speakers are perturbing the air between your ears and the speakers, and that your brain is converting those vibrations into the sound of my voice. And this is a visualization of what such a vibration would look like as an acoustic vortex. Acoustic vortex, like all vortexes, they spin in one direction or the other, and the center is often empty or very low pressure. So in the wind egg, one of the facilities that we created within the L1 wind tunnel at the Von Karman Institute was an acoustic vortex to incubate the wind eggs. This was done with physicists from the University of Antwerp. So sound is being emitted from each of the speakers in a circular rotation. And that means that the sound is coming in and out of phase, creating a kind of spiral movement of sound down the length of the tunnel. And the center itself becomes empty. So in the center, you don't hear any sound. It cancels itself out. And on the outskirts, you hear quite a loud sound. And these are then the wind eggs, which was actually an existing experiment that we had done, that scientists had already done before I arrived at the Von Karman Institute. They'd use these eggs in order to see what would happen if wind penetrated the surface of these eggs and recorded then the sound that was created within. And as you saw from the film, incidentally, that was a heartbeat sound. This is what those eggs look like at the second installation of this piece at the Muka Museum in Antwerp. And here's one of our researchers, wind egg researchers, Salka, listening to the silence in the center of the vortex. And for me, like this project, it was the first of a trilogy. So I conducted the project 3 times. Once at the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics, secondly at the Harlan Levy Projects, a gallery in Brussels, and thirdly at the Muka Museum in Antwerp. And for me, what was interesting was how can we kind of move between an institution to a commercial gallery to a museum, also as a way of interpolating between the different kinds of neutrality that each of these spaces claim to have. So suddenly through this repetition, we're also creating a register for the differences within the qualities of this kind of neutrality that each space claims, which is something that's very interesting to me. Like, why can an experiment be reproduced in many different labs in order to create a verifiable truth? And same for artworks that can move from one gallery to another and expect the same kind of aesthetic experience. And this is the installation of the gallery there. So here we have I'd like to move on to the another instance that was very important. And maybe I realize also I haven't like kind of re-summarized the plot of the wind egg yet. So the wind egg itself is playing on the notion, it's taking up the notion that's existed in many different cultures for the last 3,000 years, that animals and people can be fertilized by the wind, the way that plants are. And that within the air itself, there is a kind of aerial spermatozoa that's kind of permeating the air. It was often thought that certain animals are only female and only reproduced with the wind, and that it also at times affected people. So the most common example we might know in the West is the Virgin Mary's Immaculate Conception, which was justified until the late 17th century by theologians as being an instance of wind fertilization. And God himself is often in many cultures also associated with wind as spirit, as vitality itself, as a kind of created spirit blowing through. And I wanted to realize this notion using the cutting edge wind tunnel technology at the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics. So yes, I'm going back a little bit, but I hope it still makes sense. And if the wind functions in this way, like following the narrative, then we could say that the wind itself must be gendered in this sense. And here we have a wind tunnel. This is the L7 wind tunnel at the Von Karman Institute, in which we were able to actually visualize the face of the wind itself. So you can see this is a delta wing here, just in front, and the black triangle, which produces as the face. This is a second installation that I made in order to reproduce within a gallery, because everything that happens at the Von Karman Institute can't leave the Von Karman Institute itself. If we see, here's the face, also with one of our researchers, Céline Mathieu here. And we tried to communicate with it. So in this case, we were trying to see if it would react by injecting a certain kind of poetry. And this is a modernist poem called The Red-Haired Man by Daniel Harms, which I like quite a lot. I don't think we have time to read through it yet at the moment, but here's what the face looks like here. So just for the sake of time, I will continue. What was important to me was, like, are we also seeing the face of the wind itself? Or are we projecting or personifying, anthropomorphizing nature? And also in the moment of the Anthropocene, can we really make that distinction so cleanly anymore? This is a study with fetuses in the womb, which it actually looks at if fetuses can in fact recognize facial patterns. So they were exposed to the dot patterns A, B, to which they reacted with movement, but they didn't react to CD, which is, doesn't look quite like a face. This is elaborating on the premise that, well, the fetuses can recognize a face even before they've ever seen one. In that case, and these are instances, like of seeing the same type of face. This is a book called Simulacra from the 70s, also seeing the same kind of double vortex face in nature everywhere we go. This is from the wind tunnel again. And once you see it, I noticed that you start to see it everywhere in architecture as well, in architectural facades and ornament, especially in ironwork. And to me, this might be a kind of like warding off, or a kind of maneuver like the evil eye, in which you want to acknowledge that which might cause you harm. So buildings are constantly exposed to the wind, so they want to acknowledge it in order to kind of protect themselves from it, a sort of talismanic effect. It was often thought that vultures were animals that reproduce specifically with the wind. This is something that was common in all of the mythologies that I came across and looked at. And it was interesting for me to bring vultures to the NATO institution as well, to create an aviary there. This is the falconeer that we were working with, and the aviary, and to think about new forms of conception with an animal that's normally associated with death. So this is the same vulture at Harlan Levy projects there. And you can see also formal similarities. So the shape of the floor here at the aviary at the Von Karman Institute then transferred to the second installation, where it was sort of elevated and brought up and became a housing within which you saw within which was the face of the wind is being housed, and on top of which Sparta the vulture could live. And in a way, this is a kind of like arranged marriage, a sort of housing between the wind and the vulture in this case. So here's the turbulence there at the Harlan Levy projects, using a different type of using a projector instead of a laser. And at the Muka Museum, it looked like this. So I reproduced the Tower of the Winds, an ancient building in Athens, one of the first weather stations, let's call it, which used to house a water clock, also playing on the association with the passage of time, fluidity of time, and fluidity of water and other materials. So I replicated this also to house the face of the wind, with the 8 Greek gods of the wind around the outside, and within which you'd also then see the face of the wind. And in this case, it was connected to weather stations at every line of longitude all over the world. And so that live data was coming in, affecting the shape or affecting the position of the wing, which would then affect the expression of the face. So the idea was that this face that you were seeing was the representation of all of the world's winds. And lastly, the last iteration, and maybe the one that I will also close on here, is I also wanted to see if the face could express, if we could find another way of relating to nature, and kind of another way of embodying it, because there is a degree of alienation that exists between us, ourselves as individuals, and the world around us. So could we embody something as ephemeral as the wind itself? So I worked at the Brain and Emotion Laboratory at the University of Maastricht, where we were picking up bioelectrical feedback signals, often associated with emotional expression within the face and the body, and using those also to control the face. So it became a type of avatar. And this is what images from the installation there then that we see. Lastly, I know I'm going a little bit over, but I just want to touch a bit very quickly on newer developments. And I'm kind of like now wanting to build on how the wind moves at a larger geographic scale. So I've been inspired by the work of Masanao Abe, a Japanese meteorologist in the post-war period who spent his career studying the cloud formations around Mount Fuji and trying to reproduce them within a wind tunnel. By the time he finally did, he wasn't able to show how he had done it. So in a way, it crosses from the domain of science into art in that case. And this is presented beautifully in a book by Helmut Volter called Movement of Clouds Around Mount Fuji there. And this is something that I've taken up now at Lebec Foundation in Switzerland, working with the weather station and trying to capture the winds that came from the Vaudaire or the Valais winds that came over the lake. And now also looking at the winds that are for Science Gallery in Venice, looking at the winds that are coming off of the Sahara in particular. So these are just some inspirational images that I've been using. The winds that blow from the Sahara blow the dust up north towards Europe, specifically the Scirocco wind that we'll be working with at the Science Gallery in Venice. This wind that takes African air and other materials and particulates over the Mediterranean and also has been associated with many negative things related to health as well. To think about this also as an analog for thinking about how to consider our present, consider our relationship to the environment, and yeah, present new narratives in that sense. So with that, I'll stop my presentation. Okay. And yeah, I think now we will transition back to the discussion. I'm very happy to address any questions that might have come up from you.
Okay, so one question has just popped up, so I'll go straight into that question now because it relates directly to the wind egg. And somebody said, in the film you mentioned the possibility of reproduction without men. Is there a gender or political statement that you wanted to make here? They were obviously teasing.
Yeah, well, I think that this is, for me, if you follow this idea, inevitably it brings us to that question. And for me, that's an interesting question, because I wonder about how different our social bonds and social structures would be if they were not connected to the family structure, for instance, as we know it now. And I think this also brings us to a question about different ways of that genders can relate to one another. It also brings us to questions of surrogacy. Is that and reproductive labor? Because in the case of the wind egg, maybe the reproduction is still happening within the female body, but I did look a little bit into artificial wombs, but I haven't quite gotten there yet, and also amniotic fluid. In a way, this was sort of like the fundamental research of the wind egg, with its kind of future implications, and I think there are many different kinds of implications, but it's something that, yeah, I would like to delve into further eventually.
Mm. I mean, that's the fascinating bit about your practice, is that you really look at context and you start deconstructing the kind of tales we tell ourselves, whether it's about science or whether it's about art. You're deconstructing those contexts and really questioning those. Where did that kind of questioning impulse come from you? Did you always have that in your childhood? Was it something which was with you from way back?
I think what's, yeah, I think it's very interesting. I mean, to me, it it reminds me of one of Solowitz's questions on, or statements on conceptual art, from his sentences on conceptual art, where he says that illogical thoughts should be pursued absolutely logically. And what's very interesting to me is, yeah, like how far you can sort of, where that will take you. Because I think that we also operate on a notion that society is functioning entirely rationally, but I think like that's often a sort of veil of humanity underneath it, which is of course a mixture of both, you know. Yeah, at once, but we have these kind of assumptions. So what's interesting for me in this practice is also to see where it takes me, where the questions can sort of where one might arrive. And that's what's most exciting about artistic practices. You often arrive at places you never anticipated you would get to when you first started, you know?
But you have a particular obsession with the wind. I mean, the wind is literally the focus of your practice. And you explained it in relation to air, and how air is like being an artist, giving form, wanting to give form to things. But why are you so obsessed by the wind in particular, which is one particular aspect of air?
Well, I mean, if you, I think like if I kind of psychoanalyze myself, if you ask my mom, she would say it said I wanted to be a pilot when I was very young, and then I decided I couldn't do that. I got glasses and so on, so I was going to be an aeronautical engineer, and then I completely forgot about that for like 25 years or something, and sort of found my way back in a certain way. And but what I also think is that where I grew up in Ohio, it's like it's the Black Swamp region, which is close to the Great Lakes. So it's a terrain that's like just incredibly flat, just absolutely flat. So the most interesting thing to see is the sky itself and its transitions, because it sort of just vanishes into a horizon. And I feel like I'm not the only one who's been subject to that either. I was looking into it. I kind of anecdotally found out that the most amount of astronauts are also from Ohio, in fact. So I think that, yeah, that you sort of start to develop a relationship with the sky and the air, and it's and all of its changes start to affect you also quite dramatically in this particular region. But it's something that once you start thinking through it, it doesn't. It's so difficult to grasp that it sort of just keeps on sucking you in. It's a bit of a vortex in itself, you know.
Well, I've got two questions from people listening. One is, in a lot of popular films, particularly dystopic ones, we see the wind as a very negative force, bringing destruction and danger. What are the positive connotations of the wind that you've found in your research?
That's a really good point, actually, and this is something that I've been looking into a bit for other. Yeah, after this piece which you saw, I was looking into representations of the wind and Foley devices used in cinema and theater, indeed to like announce a change. Like if we look at Shakespeare's Tempest and so on, it also starts with this great storm that sort of brings them to the island, and it's often a very foreboding thing. It's also in Faust. It means like the coming of the devil actually sort of arrived in this town. But I think it's because it relates often negatively because it's related to change, and change for us is unpredictable, and it's and for that reason it's scary. So that kind of instability is sort of inevitably leads to paranoia or anxiety, at least in our age. But in the past, in the past, it's related to. In the past, it's related, like for example, in the Bible, we have the breath of God itself is ruach. In Genesis, it's the thing that announces it's the breath of God, which brings reality into existence even before the existence of light. So there is often this connection between breathing, vitality, creation, and that's always that's, you see that in many different cultures. So for example, in Arabic, the word raha is to breathe, and the word ruhu means soul. So there's this sort of direct connection between that. Yeah, and I think that still persists in a way. Yeah.
Connection between wind and soul. So another question's popped in. There are lots of questions that are all building up. And again, this one is, in your practice, you use technology a lot, wind tunnels and fluid dynamics. Have you studied these things, is the questions, and how did you create an artistic practice which is so engaged with technology?
It was it's something that developed. I haven't had a training. I went to art school, like Art Institute of Chicago, and then while I was there, I realized that I wanted to move beyond the typical modes of depiction or representation that artists are typically bound to. I found that there's a kind of weird anachronism that the way in art education that it was taking place, that for some reason the 3D printers and the laser cutters were in the architecture and industrial design department, and also the computers, whereas the artists were still working in a way that was not dissimilar to 200 years prior or 150 years prior. So it's yeah, for me, it's, if I would like to, I'm interested in technology, not because I want to produce novel effects or try to think of new ways in which technology can be applied. But I'm really interested in the ways in which the role that science and technology plays in our current social understanding of ourselves, and especially in relationship to ideas of progress, where we've really like exclusively relegated or attributed progress to technology and science, in the absence also of, I think, larger social narratives of and ideological movements that had existed in the 20th century and so on. So I want to work with technology to pose a critique of it kind of from the inside, rather than more of a superficial or something from the outside in that way.
And it's also been said your practice is trying to create a kind of techno poetics as well.
Yeah, I think this is why I tried to, sorry, go ahead.
No, what would you say to that? Yeah.
It's a term that was introduced to me by Gedimina Sorbonas, who's a professor at MIT that I worked with a lot, and I think that for me, I find it like a robust one in the last 10 years or so since that time. It's I think that there are many kind of metaphorical and aesthetic moments that are contained within the transformation of material that happens through technique. So this is a bit why I gave this example of the EU Parliament, where there's, I think, like a strong political commentary bound up in just trying to resolve a unforeseen architectural problem, concerning turbulences that are created by the Parliament itself. So this is a bit, and for me, I think that the way that art has to be sort of political is indirectly, like I think it should mean have the capacity to mean more than one thing at once, because art has that exclusive possibility to have multiple readings that are equally valid and unique. But in order to do that, then I think it's great to also allow people to also arrive at some of the insinuations that you're also trying to instigate. And also, if they don't want to, they can leave them entirely and focus on some of the formal aspects or other experiences that maybe me as an artist hadn't anticipated either as a effect of the work.
I think that's something really beautiful you just touched on, that art actually gives you a multiplicity of narratives, while science can be driven by one narrative for one purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which I hadn't thought before until you said it. And then I went, oh yes, of course, that's what it is, about the different multiplicity of threads which any individual, any group seeing a piece can follow.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the structure of the inquiry of in sciences, you start with a hypothesis, which you then pursue to see if it's true or not. And in the arts, I think the experimentation happens first, and then you're almost an observer of the phenomena which you're creating itself. Even though you have a direction and an intention, it's not necessarily the same thing as what you're doing, which is a funny thing to admit, as an artist as well. And then you kind of and that's a bit how the wind egg also arose, as I was doing many different things within the lab, and it also was a structure that started to cohere and integrate many of these different aspects that were kind of simultaneously arising.
So Venice, what attracted you to coming and exploring the wind in Venice then with us on the residency?
Well, it was for me super exciting to see a project that was exclusively dedicated to looking at the movement of the wind. And this is something that I hadn't seen before. And it just felt like such a great fit, and in particular, I was very excited about the situation of Venice, when I looked more into it and I started to see how it sits at the crossing of these multiple winds, and that each of these have like a very rich narrative that's been elaborated over centuries in relationship to them. So there's the Scirocco, but there are others also that come down from the Dolomite Mountains and so on. And how this, it just sort of, I think, so there's like the broader context, but I think then also the context of the Science Gallery as well, and gives it the right type of focus. Because sometimes I need to introduce the wind itself as a topic, as a starting point, starting from scratch. But in this case, I feel like there's an opportunity to go much farther because it's already focused on wind.
Cat bombed. I'm so anyway. Yeah, but yeah. So the wind. I mean, Venice. One of the things you were really interested in is the way the wind has actually shaped the architecture of Venice as well. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, because that's fascinating. And hopefully we won't be cat bombed again. So yeah.
Yeah, the more I learn about it, the more I see that there are many different considerations that have been played out. So in particular with the work of Scamozzi, who's an important architect who had built San Marco Square and among many other buildings. The wind was often a consideration in its orientation and the relationship of windows and how many, and also as a leitmotif on the ornamentation as well. And this for me, as you saw in the presentation, was already an important interest. And what I see also in the city plan of Venice too is that because they had multiple plague and quarantine times, in conversation with Craig Martin, who's one of the other people in the project now, professor at Safoscari, been looking into the plan of the city and how they had gone through multiple periods of plague and tried to incorporate this into the plan of the city, which they often thought was associated with the direction of the wind, and that health itself is related to wind. So he was working on translations of treatises, medical treatises that related to good health regimes that instructed on how to, when you should open certain windows facing in which direction, depending on seasons, in order to create certain types of ventilation, which were beneficial for health. Also, the Tereti Islands, the quarantine islands, are in a specific area in which the wind is blowing away from the city. So there was also this quite important understanding already that yeah, as we're coming to know now, that many things are transmitted through the air, including bacteria and viruses as well. So
yes.
And,
so the link with the pandemic is extraordinary, as well as also with migration as well.
I think those two are already like an analog to one another too. So the way that it's been discussed, at least in European politics, the migration crisis and like an influx or an overload. Yeah.
So you haven't physically been in Venice yet, and the Earth Water Sky Residency we've had to adapt it now from being 2 months present to 1 month digital, and 1 month present when you're able to be present. It must be very tantalizing for you to to be now connected with, for example, Craig Martin and Ca' Foscari University, and the maps and plans and architecture of Venice and the research, and yet for Venice to be so far away from you at the moment, though you're hoping to come in end of October. I wondered what that feels like as an artist to be in that kind of formless space, really.
Yeah, it's been interesting because, of course, like a project like this, which is highly collaborative, depends on a certain type of presence with collaborators and a certain type of enthusiasm that I feel like starts to build up and kind of becomes like a prime mover that that takes you and helps you to specify different directions that you want to take as well. And at the moment, I think we've been able to have different kinds of discussions, which might help to prepare for that in a way. So looking more broadly at existing texts and in particular, this book, Ian Fenlon's Ceremonial City, has been really interesting, which marks the defeat of the Ottomans in the 15th century. It was a year of processions through the city and commissioned operas and performances and sculptures throughout the city. And this is a bit what I'd inevitably like to do in Venice, is also create a type of processional work that moves through the city the way that the wind does. So it's nice to know that there are these precedents, and it's been this time at least has allowed for looking into those further or more in detail.
Yeah, and that's a hallmark also of your practice, that you do performance as well as architecture, and you collaborate. You've got a very strongly collaborative practice. You're not just the lone artist on his or her own, you collaborate. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what you're planning potentially for Venice, for the residency, and what we can potentially see next year, hopefully.
I'd like to follow a structure similar to what we've seen here in the film, actually, which itself was actually a site-specific performance that happened for one day, even though there had been actually years of build-up before. But it was I had permission for one day to have the entire facility, and then there was a performance, and on that same day we shot the film, and then each of these things became kind of three different kind of entities that sort of synergize with one another. And I like this approach, and this is sort of what it's ambitious, but I think they inform one another in beneficial ways. So this is a bit what I'd like to do when I arrive in Venice. I'm very curious to see to meet the students also in Safuskai. And these, I mean, I think people have take advantage of the degree of familiarity that people have with the city, who know it every day, because I think there might be many particularities, specific small streets that have small wind canyons within them, or at different times of day, for instance, and the type of way in which the city is shaped by the wind, but the way that the wind is also shaping, the way that the city is shaped by the wind, and also the way the city is shaping the wind as well. And specifically, it's not actually about the wind, it's about the experience of the wind that we have, and the associations that we have with it as well. And yeah, how does it become meaningful for us?
And this will be your first visit, won't it? It will be your first.
I've made the pilgrimage to Venice in the past for the Biennale and so on, but
first visit as an artist, as a practicing artist doing research. Yeah.
Yes.
There's another question that's popped in, which is, do you think the winds pull together humanity by blowing from one country to another? Do winds actually make us a little closer?
I think what's been interesting is to see how the winds form a global network, which is already existing, that might help us to familiarize with bring back into grasp the kind of global network that we ourselves have created over the surface of the earth, but that the one created by the wind and air currents it's always existed as well. So what's interesting for me is, for example, the Saharan wind that's blowing as a Scirocco up to Venice. There's another Saharan wind that's blowing across the Atlantic and feeding the Amazon rainforest with necessary phosphorus that it needs to grow, and that this is a global ecosystem, that's vital in itself as well. And yeah, I think it's interesting for me to then draw these comparisons between the two, because I think they both have different degrees of understanding. I think even the internet for us, it can seem as as alienating as the experience of the weather, which seems also completely out of control or out of our hands each day. You know, so yeah.
And there's another question which says, do you think that our impression of the wind will change with climate change?
Well, I think that there's intensifications that are happening, like with for example, with the wildfires that are happening now in the west coast of the U.S. They're fed largely also by increased wind, wind patterns. I think, yeah, we will start to. I think that like in a way, like with the popularization of the language of Anthropocene, it's harder to make the distinction between nature as distinct from society and from us. So we'll have to start thinking of these things in a much more integrated way. But that might not lead to a greater sense of holistic understanding, in a sense. You know, it might also mean that we just realize we don't know ourselves as much as we don't know the weather, the weather patterns either. But for me, it's important to ask that question. You know, otherwise we're back in the 1950s with cybernetic discourse, thinking that we can sort of enact large-scale systems of control that create through feedback loops and so on. But I don't think that that's really a viable way of conducting ourselves or society either, or yeah, personally.
So thank you so much, Haseeb, for giving us an insight into your practice, and also for giving us an insight into what you are going to do at Science Gallery Venice on the Earth Water Sky Residency programme. And the plan is for Haseeb to create a digital presence which the public will be able to log in and out of and follow and track his process as he research and contribute as well. So stay tuned and look on the Science Gallery Venice website to when we announce it's happening, as well as our Twitter feed, as well as our Facebook feed. And big thank you to Fondation Didier and Martine Primat for funding the Earth, Water, Sky residencies, which is totally dedicated to artists working with environmental scientists in the Veneto region, particularly based at Ca' Foscari University. And what we're really looking forward to welcoming you in person to Science Gallery Venice. I know the whole Science Gallery Venice team are hopefully end of October and November, fingers crossed, but there will be a digital presence, and look forward to seeing what you produce. But it will be all about the process, so we're looking forward to being part of the process with you, Haseeb, as well as I'm sure the public as well. So thank you very, very much, and see you virtually and physically soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ariane. Looking forward to working with you and also seeing you very soon as well. Yeah.
Bye. Thank you for joining us all. Bye.